My Name Is Tani Chapter 10 to 15. Part 2. Searching for Home. 10. Family Connection. Oluwatoyin. In some ways, Kaode and I are different people who come from very different worlds. I can talk almost as much as Tani, while Kaode is more like Austin, weighing his words with thought and care before he shares them with those around him. I was raised a Muslim, although not a strict one in any sense of the word. Kaode comes from a long line of Christians. My father had almost as many wives as Muhammad, while Kaode's father married only once. I am one of 20 children. Kaode is one of just 5. And while my father's ancestors were farmers, scratching out a living in the red African soil, my husband is a prince. That's right, a genuine Nigerian prince, whose grandfather served the people of the Ado-Ekiti region as their Yui, their king. When you are young and you fall in love, differences like these do not matter at all. Oftentimes, they are part of the attraction that draws you together. Then, as you grow and raise a family, the contrasts in your background begin to take on a new significance and gain a new value. As you share with your children the stories from your youth, offer your perspective on the challenges facing them today, and listen to your husband share his own, the differences become a source of inspiration, a deep pool of experience from which you can draw. But no matter how great the contrasts in personality and background, what matters most are the things that unite you. Your vision, your values, your purpose. For Kaode and me, so much of who we are is defined by where we come from. Even though Kaode's ancestry is so much more impressive than mine and his friends really do address him as Prince, there is one part of our history that binds us close and shapes our lives so much that we are closer than the air we breathe. We are not just Nigerians. We are Yoruba. Of the 3 main tribes in my homeland, Yoruba are known for being the most respectful. We talk well of people and are renowned for our willingness to help others. If you visit our territory and do happen to see someone behaving poorly in public, perhaps someone not crossing the street to help another struggling with an armful of bags, or a young person not addressing an elder with the appropriate respect, you will inevitably see people begin to point and hear them call out, "Are you sure that you're Yoruba?" We take such pride in belonging to our tribe that often the question alone is enough to draw out an apology and put matters right. Yoruba people are also famous for our hospitality. We are accommodating and generous and expect to throw our doors open to any family member who visits. We live in community with the people we love and think nothing of sharing our home and possessions with others. So, while Islam taught my father that it was permissible to take 4 wives and a mistress, it was the fact that he was Yoruba that led him to have all those women and children living with him under one roof. We lived well together. So many of my childhood memories are of our compound being full to overflowing with people attending one of the many parties we held throughout the year. The air would be thick with the smell of wood smoke, my mouth salivating at the prospect of the food on offer: jollof rice, pounded yam, soups full of spices, and at the smells that lingered for hours. When people were fed and happy, my sisters and I would get up and perform a traditional dance while several of our uncles beat out a frenzy on the drums. We'd kick and spin and smile as the crowd cheered. And with as many as 100 adults in attendance, we'd make good money at the end as we walked among them and asked, respectfully, whether they would be willing to give us a coin or 2. On nights like those, I felt as though the whole world was my home. Kaode's family was far smaller than mine, just 1 father and mother, and he and his 4 siblings, but it was even more traditional. Historically, in Yoruba families, the wealthiest member builds a big home that the whole extended family can live in. Kaode's father did just that, filling his compound with a long, low building that could accommodate dozens of people. The house was built with a corridor down the middle, with several 2-room apartments running off either side. In each apartment, made up of a bedroom and a parlor, was an uncle with his wife and children. The whole extended family would eat their meals together, play together, and share life together. And when Kaode's father heard of a young couple in need of accommodations because their own family lived on the other side of the country, he gave them a room to rent. Before long they, too, were thought of as family and stayed in the home for 20 years. For Yoruba people like us, family is everything. Even though Kaode and I lived alone with our boys, we were still deeply connected to our army of aunts and uncles, cousins and siblings, grandparents and parents. Many times each year, we would all gather together, drawn like the tides toward the gravity of the moon. We belonged likewise to them, and they to us. So it was painful to have to go into hiding when we moved to Akure and cut ourselves off from our family to keep them safe. But to leave Nigeria the way we did in June 2017 was even harder. Boko Haram had not just stolen our peace and threatened our security, it had ripped us away from our home and stolen from us our family, tearing us from the very people we had lived alongside since our first breath here on Earth. But as we flew across the Atlantic, there was one star of hope ahead of us. We were heading to Dallas, to my uncle and his American family. With so much that was unclear in the future, it was good to know that we would find a new home there.
11. First Impressions of America. Kaode. Oluwatoyin and I were both confused. We stood in the Greyhound bus terminal in New Jersey, looking at the map. 1,500 miles in 36 hours? Oluwatoyin repeated. Could that be a mistake? I knew all about long journeys. Less than a year earlier, I had made a trip in Nigeria. I needed to travel to a neighboring state on business, a total distance of 100 miles. Since most of my drive was on the freeway, I assumed that if I left early enough in the morning, I would arrive before dark. But when I reached the halfway point, the freeway had been washed away by a river. Cars and trucks swarmed in tight all around me, and soon the road was blocked solid. Like every other driver, I remained calm. These things happen in Nigeria, where the roads are often lined with potholes that cause speeding trucks and buses to flip over and lie across the road like fallen trees. In those cases, it can take 24 hours to get traffic moving again. But on this particular occasion, I was not just trapped for one night. I was stuck for 3. So 1,500 miles in 36 hours? Impossible. But as soon as I climbed onto the bus, I knew things were different. The Greyhound was more luxurious than any bus I had ever ridden on at home. But it was the roads that I noticed most. As we pulled out of the city and headed west toward Pittsburgh, along freeways lined with forests and fields, not once did the bus swerve to avoid a pothole or slow to a halt and kill its engine while the road ahead was cleared. We just drove, strong and steady, farther and farther away from Nigeria. After 13 sleepless hours of flying and almost half that long waiting in line at airports, 36 hours on a bus gives you a lot of time to yourself. And while the boys and Oluwatoyin were able to sleep for some of the journey to Dallas, I was awake and thinking. I did not mind so much. With every hour that passed and every mile we sped along, I felt happier. For the first time in months, I let my thoughts drift. I was able to put most of my worries about Boko Haram from my mind. I allowed myself to think about this new adventure we were beginning. Of course, I had been thinking a lot about America ever since we decided to take the vacation, but now that we were finally here, my thoughts took on new shapes. As we drove past car dealerships the size of farms and billboards that rose into the air like ship's sails, I recognized it all. Even though I had never seen an environment so consistently wealthy before, it was still so familiar to me. How can one country be so good at planting its image in the minds of people who live thousands of miles away? I remembered the way people responded to the news of our visas, how old friends and relatives from far and wide called to pass on their congratulations, as if we had not been granted visas, but won some national honor or been awarded a life-changing cash prize. None of them had ever been to America, and I doubted whether any of them would ever be fortunate enough to visit, but they all knew that the opportunity ahead of us was truly great. Yet some of them were wrong in how easy they imagined it to be. I remember one friend telling me, as soon as you arrive in New York, you will see dollars lying in the road. You can pick them up and become rich just like that. I never believed him, but I shared his joy and optimism. And by the time I was sitting on the bus next to my sleeping wife and behind my 2 sleeping boys, I knew that if something good was going to happen in my life, it was bound to happen here in America. We stopped every few hours. Cleveland, Indianapolis, St. Louis, Tulsa, some places I had heard of, other names were new to me. But at every stop, There were bright lights and vending machines and clean water in the bathrooms and people smiling at us. Everything worked. Nothing was broken. And every time we climbed back on board the bus again, my confidence in America grew just a little bit stronger. By the time we stepped off the bus and stood stretching and yawning in the Dallas evening, watching Oluwatoyin's uncle and his wife waving to us from inside the terminal, I was convinced that we had arrived in the greatest place on the planet.
12. Where the lights don't go out. Tani. In Nigeria, the lights are always going out. You can be watching TV or be on your computer and then bang. Just like that, there's no more electricity in your house. When I was a really little kid, I used to think that it was because we had to take turns to share the electricity with the other houses. But then I realized that the whole city would be without lights for lots of days, so it wasn't about sharing. One day I asked my dad about the lights, and he said that it is because of people who are corrupt and act like thieves, but I never really got how you can steal something you can't see. Most of the time when the lights went out in my home, it was okay, though. All I had to do was ask Mom or Dad or Austin to go outside and start the generator, and then the lights would come back on. But if you don't have a generator, it's not so good. So when we got to Dallas and arrived at the new house where my cousins lived, and they fed us spaghetti and fish and rice, and Mom and Dad laughed and smiled and looked really, really happy, I looked for the generator. I couldn't find one. I was thinking that maybe the house wasn't so good after all. I wanted to ask the woman that Mom told us all to call Grandma, even though she wasn't our real grandma, what do you do when the lights go out? But she was kinda scary, and so I kept quiet. But then I realized something. We'd been in America for almost 3 days already, and the lights hadn't gone out. I had never counted the days at home, but I knew that the lights could be out for a long, long time. Like days and days and weeks and weeks. It gets so common that it's actually weird when you don't hear the sound of generators running. I was counting the days, and when I got to 10, I knew I had to tell Mom about it. We've been here 10 days now, and the lights have not gone off even once. She smiled and her eyes went all big, the way they did whenever I told her that I'd done well at school or that I loved her. And I knew that she was amazed just like I was.
13. Adapting to cultural differences. Oluwatoyin. At first, everything in Dallas was good. Growing up in a house with 19 siblings and 4 stepmoms, I learned from a young age to love a crowd. I am comfortable living in small spaces with others when every movement around the home is like a dance as you weave and swirl around each other. So the fact that my uncle and his wife shared their house with some of their adult children and several teenage grandchildren made me happy. It was good to be back in the chaos and warmth of a large family. It was even better to be with my uncle. Even though I'd spoken to him regularly on the phone over the years, I'd never actually met him in person before. My mom and he had talked all the time on the phone when I was growing up, and I always enjoyed joining in on the calls. Meeting him in person was wonderful. He was so gentle and kind and reminded me so much of my mom, his sister, that I immediately felt at home in his presence. However, some things were a little more different than I expected. My uncle had immigrated to America 40 years earlier, and he was not married to a Nigerian. His wife, whom we instinctively called Grandma out of respect, was an African-American woman, and she could not have been more different from him. He was quiet, laid back, and preferred to let life take its course rather than stress about things. His wife was full of energy and passion, and it was obvious that she was the kind of woman who was comfortable making decisions and directing the group. So when it was time to go with the family to church on the first Sunday that we were there, it was Grandma who stood by the front door and shouted at the whole house until we were all ready to leave. She was the one who drove, the one who chose our seats, and the one who decided where we would eat after the service. Kayode and I knew there would be many cultural differences between Nigeria and America, so we chose not to let any of this trouble us. In fact, I knew that my uncle had been having some health problems, and he looked thinner than he did in the pictures he had sent us. So part of me was grateful that he had married a woman who would relieve him of any unnecessary burdens. But I would be lying if I said that everything was perfect. When we were first shown into the house and introduced to my uncle's grandchildren, I did what any Nigerian woman would do and opened my arms wide for a hug and let the joyous smile that was burning within me shine on my face. To meet close family like this for the first time was a wonderful thing, and I was so excited to get to know them. "Hi," I sang and walked over to Damien, the youngest. He was 13 years old and sitting on the couch and playing a video game. "Give me a hug, Damien. We're family." He didn't take his eyes off the screen, but he did speak. "Do I have to?" I froze, my arms still held wide like the wings of a hovering bird. It was awkward. I turned back to Grandma, but she just shrugged and sank down into her couch. Kayode and I were given a room to ourselves, while Tani and Austin were given beds in the same room as Damien and his older brother, Terrell. At first, everything was good. But within a few days, there were arguments breaking out between the boys. It was nothing unusual, nothing unexpected even. Just Terrell or Damien complaining about their stuff being touched or moved. But it bothered our boys. They had never before encountered someone who was a blood relative who did not treat them as such. Family can never be smooth all the time, I told them many times. All we can do is act in a loving way and try to get along. My uncle could see what was going on, and he had a suggestion of his own. He told us that it was like this every time his grandkids were on vacation. They sit down in front of that TV and play their games all day long. It's only a matter of time before they start getting on each other like this. But they'll be back at school next week. Why don't you enroll Austin and Tani too? Kayode and I both liked the idea immediately. My own father had valued education above all things, and between the school closures in Abuja and our brief vacation in Akure, the boys had missed more school than we were happy with. So, with Grandma's help, I took the passports, immunization cards, and 2 not-so-happy Adewumi boys to the local school and signed them up to start the following week. With them at school, surely we would finally be able to settle. Wouldn't we?
14. Restless without work. Kayode. My father was the son of a king, but he still had to work. By the time I was born, my father had established his own construction business. By the time I was old enough to hold a shovel, he was ready to put me to work. I helped where I could, digging and carrying and fetching at home. When I was 10 years old, my father won a contract to build a hotel outside the city. Each Saturday, he would take my brother and me to the building site. We were children, but there was no playing for us. Instead, we were each given a job to do. We fetched water and wood, mixed mortar, and cleaned the tools at the end of the day. It was hot, hard work, and there were times when I complained, "Why are you making us work like this?" My father would look at me, place his hands on his hips, and lock his eyes on mine. "I am teaching you how to make it in life. You are a prince, but do you want to be a king like my father? Nobody will ever choose a lazy person to be king. Never rely on your family name alone. Work hard, always." I knew he was right. In our region, kings are a little like governors, senators, or mayors, and are chosen by a group of 10 or 15 people who are the kingmakers. Anyone who wants to be king must be of good character and well known in society. All the same, I listened to my father's lectures, not really appreciating the wisdom in his words, but looking forward to the moment when I lined up at the end of each day and received my wages. And when I had saved enough money to buy my first radio, the lesson had finally been learned. Years later, when I owned my print shop, I decided to walk in my father's footsteps. I worked hard at any and every task that was before me. Whether it was finding customers and negotiating contracts or carrying paper around the shop and bringing my machine operators the tools or equipment they needed, I was always willing to work. So laziness has never been an option for me. When we arrived in Dallas, Oluwatoyin and I both wanted to work. My wife dedicated herself to sweeping and mopping the floors every morning, to preparing food and keeping the whole house tidy. But me? Our uncle and grandma owned an airport shuttle business, and I asked him if I could help in any way, perhaps by driving some of the shifts. He said no. This is America. You cannot work unless you have your papers. So it is best that you forget about this idea of having a job. Relax, enjoy yourself, take a break. Sit at home. It's better than working. I did not like any of those words. How could sitting around the house all day be better than working? By the time the boys started at school, I was feeling restless. Within a week or two, I had grown frustrated. Days went by, and all I did was sleep, eat, take walks around the block, and lie on the bed waiting for something to happen. It never did. "Uncle," I asked one morning when he was about to head out the door and start work, "please, is there nothing I can do? I need to work." "No," he said, looking nervous. "You probably shouldn't even be walking around outside so much, at least not without your passport. This is America, and they can deport you just like that if you break the rules." He closed the front door behind him. I listened to the car start and wanted to call out that I was not breaking any rules. I wanted to tell him that I did not see work as a crime and that I thought America would recognize that hard work was a good thing. I said nothing, though. Instead, I walked back to the bedroom and lay down on the bed. I had gone from being a prisoner of my own fear in Nigeria to becoming a prisoner of my uncle's fear in America. It was no way for a man to live.
15. Tears all around. Tani. At first things were good in Dallas, even though we had to go to school. I liked the way the library was full of books and there were so many computers that nobody had to share. I liked it when Damien was playing his video games and he didn't notice me watching from the doorway. And I liked the way that in Dallas you could go out to a restaurant and eat food from any country in the world. But then two things happened, and life in Dallas got bad. Not just kind of bad. Really bad. The first thing was something with my dad. After I had been at school for 2 or 3 weeks, he told me that he was going back to Nigeria. I asked him something like, "Why are you going back already? We only just got here." He said, "I need to go back so that I can sell my machines and come back with enough money to live here." I did not like it. I don't think Mom liked it either, because after he left, she started looking really worried and sad. Sometimes when I walked into her room, she tried to pretend that she had not just been crying. The other problem was the boys. Mom and Dad had told Austin and me to be really friendly to them. It worked for Austin, but it did not work for me. Even though I tried to ask lots of questions, they wouldn't talk to me. They'd stare at me like I was dirty. They'd kick my stuff around the bedroom. And then they started getting in my face about things. There was one time when I was licking my finger because we had eaten candy and some of it had gotten stuck on my fingernail. Terrell walked up to me and hit me on the head. He said, "Don't lick your finger around me, kid." Mom saw. She was angry. "Why did you have to do that? We're family." Terrell said, "We're not family." Then Uncle came in, and the two of them started fighting together. Well, it wasn't really that they were fighting together. Terrell was shouting and saying things that I didn't believe a kid would ever say to an adult. But he just kept shouting, and Uncle just stood there like he didn't mind being shouted at. I was waiting for Uncle to make Terrell stop, but he didn't. He just stood and listened while Terrell was yelling so hard that there were these little bubbles of spit flying out of his mouth. It was surprising. I'd never seen a kid talk to an adult that way. I guess Mom didn't want me to see too much because she told me to go to her bedroom and read a book. Later that night Mom and I were both crying.